So Mal says that I should reflect on what I felt were important influences in my professional development, getting into ag economics. So it wasn't my first thought, actually. So I came from a very modest-sized farm in Monto, which I still own. Although I'm trying to convince my brother that we should really sell it because it's too much work for too little reward to maintain the wretched thing at the moment. I was very privileged in my early education because Monto did not have a high school at the time that I would have gone into secondary schooling. So the kids who were lucky enough to have a secondary education had to travel some distance, and I think I was very fortunate that my parents, along with some help from some friends who'd been there, chose the Brisbane Grammar School, which meant that I only had to get from Monto to Brisbane to go to school, whereas an earlier plan was to send me to where my cousins had been in the Toowoomba Grammar School, which would have been yet another day. As it was, the school train took 3 days to get from Monto to Brisbane, which was a lot of fun and a lot of stories to tell in its own way. But anyway, I was fortunate to go to a good school, and which had a lot of good programs that wouldn't have been available had there been a Monto high school to go to, such as, for instance, they had a good gymnasium, and it turned out that I became a gymnast, which I would never have done had I stayed in Monto. And they had a really good academic program, which initially I didn't really go in. I went into a stream that was designed for early exit back to the farm. But fortunately, some forces recognised that probably wasn't the right way to go. So I got into a much more science-based secondary education. And I was lucky I had a really good chemistry teacher, and I was really good at chemistry. And that, I think, largely led to me thinking, when I eventually got to thinking about tertiary education, that I'd like to do something in science, and naturally in agricultural science, which is why I headed to the University of Queensland, where I was lucky enough to have an open scholarship from the Queensland government to do that, which eased the pain for my parents slightly to be an undergraduate. So in 1959 I headed to the University of Queensland to an ag science program which was, looking back on it now, was very heavily focused on soils and chemistry. But while I was there, the agenda opened up quite a lot, and the University of Queensland actually employed its first agricultural economics formal teacher, one Owen McCarthy, who was had a freshly minted PhD from Iowa State. He was a Kiwi, but for some reason chose Australia rather than New Zealand to go back to post-PhD. And as in those days, the ag science curriculum featured quite a bit of flexibility in the last year and a third. 2/3 of the third year having been spent off campus at what's now part of the University of Queensland, but at that stage was the Queensland Agricultural College at Gatton. And so after the Gatton part of the course, one could start to choose some subdisciplinary emphasis to wrap up the degree program. And I had a lot of anguish about that, because originally I wanted to get into animal breeding or animal behaviour or animal nutrition, and the person who became my wife, who was in the same class, she opted for animal nutrition, so that wiped that out. The animal, because I thought we shouldn't do the same thing, And the University of Queensland at that point didn't have a very strong program in animal genetics. And in short, I decided that maybe I should give up the idea of doing anything too directly science, narrowly viewed, so to speak. But maybe the way to go was to get into this stuff called agricultural economics and farm management, which I had rather limited understanding of what the possibilities may be there. But at any rate, so I signed up for those options with working with Owen McCarthy, and in retrospect, I have no regrets about that. I think for one time in my life, I made pretty well the right decision, and because I haven't really dropped the subject since, which is maybe a negative thing as I think about it. I should have been broader. Okay, so marching right on, I was persuaded to do an extra year of undergraduate stuff for a so-called honours degree, and then it seemed like a natural thing to stay on a bit longer and do a master's degree, and I had a scholarship which eased the pain of doing that, so I did all that with Owen McCarthy. And then it became obvious that my original idea of just getting some education to go back and run the farm properly, and the bigger ambition included balloting for a bricklayer block and expanding or making better use of the equipment we had on our existing farm in a broader development context. Anyway, I started to think, well, maybe that's not a very wonderful way to go, because there's all these interesting things one can do on the more academic end of the spectrum. And so that led me to think about the possibilities of doing a PhD somewhere. And at that stage, the thing to do was to go overseas, and given that most of the people I'd already met in the field seemed to have something to do with Iowa State University, I started to think about, well, maybe I should put myself through the agonies of a Iowa State PhD. So I was thinking actively about